I want to say to all of you, happy Wednesday. And I have Mr. Sacha Tibbetts in the studios with me this morning. I want to sincerely welcome him. And I want to say to him a very happy new year. And welcome to Cayman CrossTalk Studios, my friend.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you, too.
Well, you know, Sacha, I got to ask you. This morning, we're here to talk about your plan being accepted, your integrated resource plan. I want you to break that down and what it means and why CUC is excited. I guess you would say excited that OFREG finally accepted and now putting it into place.
Well, it's a plan that we've been working on for a very long time. CUC has been trying to find a way of doing renewables on a large scale for Cayman for quite some time. Our first efforts dating back as far as, say, 2003. Where we looked into wind power in earnest and almost brought a project to fruition, which stumbled upon some of the issues with the Doppler weather radar. And we've been looking at it ever since for quite some time. The costs were a little bit higher. Wind power was the first one to come into the play with lower costs, but solar has come down to a point now where it's substantially cheaper than the status quo if done right. And so the whole challenge has been, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we take our existing portfolio of resources, which is largely dominated by diesel generating sets, with a small amount of solar on the grid, both customer-owned and at the Town plant, and how do we expand that in a way that is the optimal way and the least cost way of doing it? We could just say, all right, well, let's go and build as much solar as possible, but you have to look at what that means and how do you deal with the fluctuations from cloud cover? How do you deal with the fluctuations that occur just simply because the sun's not up? Our Grand Cayman's peak demand time is 7:45 p.m. And for those of us that live here know the sun is never shining at any time of year at 7:45 p.m. So, and that's not to say that it's an insurmountable challenge. It's just a challenge, and you have to look at how that's to be solved. And the way that you do that is you have to look at, well, what the first thing is, what do we really want to achieve with our generation resources? So when at the start of this plan, we set out and did public consultations. It was right at the time when the National Energy Policy Review was going on. And so we actually brought our consultants in and had them meet with the National Energy Policy Review Committee and say, hey, but what's important to you? We had held a public consultation meeting at the Marriott. Actually, we did 3 of them throughout the process, and said, hey, what's important to you? This is what we're thinking. What are your thoughts? And we came up with a set of goals that looked at. So in trying to decide what were we going to optimize this plan towards, it turned out that cost, shockingly, or not so shockingly, was a primary driver. But not only cost, but cost stability, right? Mm-hmm. So you see, with the reliance on diesel, we're obviously subject to market forces that nobody in the country has any control over, and there's nothing we can do about that. With some of the technologies that we're proposing in this plan, the costs become fixed. For example, if you want to look at, say, let's just look at solar, the primary cost is on the installation. Once you've installed it, the cost is essentially fixed for the rest of the project. So cost
and usually that could be up to 20 years.
Yeah, there's solar projects that they're developers and product developers that are saying even longer than that. And what ends up happening is it's not that it stops working, it just puts out less. So cost stability, there's a very strong push for environmental performance. So the driver that we looked at was reducing CO2 output from our plant or from the country's generation resources as a whole to meet the Paris Accord targets. And what that requires is a 60% reduction from the 2014 levels. Well, there's two ways that's a 60% per capita. There's two ways we can do that. We can shut our plant down 60% of the time, which would really not be an appropriate solution. Or we can find alternate resources that don't use as much CO2 or don't create CO2 or create as much CO2.
Right.
And that's exactly what the plan does. We also looked at things like making sure that there were no impacts on reliability. We looked at the impact on land use, where there was some values on diversity of resources. So right now we have one primary resource, and we said if we could have multiple resources, that would be a better thing. So the more resources that were in the mix, the higher they scored. And in the end, we came out with the plan that we have, which really hits a lot of those targets. We're looking at cost indications of a fairly stable cost over the next few decades if we can get these projects done on time and with the assumptions that were made on costs for them, because we don't know what the cost of something is going to be in 2020, but we can project it, right? And there's very good industry information on all of that was used as an input. So it's not just looking at what is the price of it today. It's looking at all of these technologies and what do we think the price of it will be in, say, 2030 when the project's going to come online. The study looked at a almost 30-year period, so from 2017 straight out to 2045. Now, long-range plans like that are really indicative in nature. And what you find is that every, say, 3 to 5 years or so, it's very important to revisit the plan and make sure your input assumptions were correct, particularly in things like cost curves, making sure that, the cost that you assumed for the future actually is correct and making corrections to those projections, running the model again. There may be a new technology that comes out that you want to input and see how that changes the optimal mix and change plans accordingly. But when you're looking at changing out a country's generation resource mix as a whole, you have to look at it with a 20, 30-year view, because it's not something you can do in 3 or 5 years without incurring substantial cost.
Well, the thing with it is, too, I have to ask you, now that you established that you were looking at and you presented that solar is going to be that, I guess, that augmented resource to diesel generation, we're kind of looking at the world now in terms of fossil fuels. There's one fact that it's not an infinite supply of fossil fuel. America probably has the largest supply right now of all of those things for a long period of time. That's projected. They're finding a little bit more pockets here and there. But one good thing with people like, industries like yours is that no longer really, you can say, geopolitical issues affect fuel prices, because you couldn't get them more, tumultuous in the Middle East than right now.
Sure.
And the prices are relatively low simply because of just how the markets are configured. So we're seeing some of the lowest rates right now in terms of fossil fuels.
Correct.
And that's a benefit really to the end consumer because of how the configuration of taxes, I guess you would say, or duties that you all pay, that is now separated out. Fuel is now separated out, so we can actually see what that is. And if it's lower, then you will lower your rates accordingly based on fuel consumption to all of us, instead of being stuck right into your aggregate.
Sure.
Because you are a publicly traded company. You have obligations to stakeholders and shareholders. I must admit, I'm a little shareholder, and my father was a visionary way back when, I think it was 1995 or something, about where the customer service plans first started buying in. So I must say my shares, I look forward every quarter because it never go down. It's a great stock for anyone to buy, to be honest with you.
Sure.
And
it makes stable returns and
always
typical utility stock, fairly strong financials, and that's important because the industry that we're in is very capital intensive. We spend tens of millions of dollars a year reinvesting into the power system every single year. We actually spend more on capital reinvestment than our income every year. It's more than the total of it goes back into the country.
And the thing, and having said all of that, then how does it work? this new integrated plan, how do you see it working? We talked about solar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that has to be configured into several different deliverables to all of you. How does it work, and whom will be your partners in that? Because CUC, as you were saying, it's capital intensive, but I don't think that you're going to go out and probably build solar plants. We just saw that, Branson just acquired, I'm not sure whether or not you all are part of that whole entire thing, but just acquired the solar plant in
We're his
Town.
customer.
And you're going to be the biggest customer of him.
Yep.
Whom else is going to supply CUC with solar?
That's still yet to be determined. In fact, CUC is very interested in developing many of these projects, if not all, if we're offered the opportunity to do that. It is a strategic goal of ours to move into renewable energy as insofar that it is possible, and insofar that it brings the cost down for our customers and doesn't impact the reliability of service. And this plan, we believe, shows us a pathway of how we can do that. Now, in terms of when and how the projects will happen and who will do them, that's still to be determined. The plan doesn't prescribe that. The plan just says, in this year, you should put this many megawatts of this technology into the mix. And then there's more detailed engineering that needs to be done than what's in the plan. The plan's very sort of high level in terms of the projects. They're not specifying where they go, just general timing, general size. And once we get into more detailed engineering, there may be, for example, maybe there's a project called for 25 megawatts of solar in a specific year. Well, the detailed engineering that comes about, the site that's available maybe can only hold 20, right? Doesn't mean we're not going to do it. We'll go forward and do the 20. Or maybe the site can hold 30, and we'd put 25 in, and in a future year, we expand and do the other 5 out or something like that. So right now, what we're doing is looking at some of that detailed work on how we're going to integrate these things into the electrical system in Grand Cayman in the most efficient way, so that we're not having to change the transmission distribution system in a manner that is not optimized as well.
I read through the integrated resource plan, completed and accepted. I think it was 129 pages of it.
Yeah.
I read through.
For those that are afraid of that, I think the first 13 pages will get you far enough.
I agree. That, in fact, the first 4 pages list a whole great deal of 60% renewable energies and so forth, and what your plans are. I got to ask you, in there I read that, with those persons whom have solar panels on their homes, one of the things that you're asking them is really, in essence, try not to do peak hours, as you said. Peak hours is around about 7:30, 7:45 in the evenings and so forth. Now, as a publicly traded company, I have to ask you, how do you maintain that you don't fall down in terms of your revenue source if you asking those with solar panels not to really hit at high peak volume hours, 7 p.m.? How are you going to make that up?
It would be better if they could. Usually never the sun is shining at that time.
Well, we got batteries and battery storage packs and so forth.
It would be beneficial to the grid if they did generate at peak time, because our costs are highest at peak, which is why our demand rates are structured as they are. Moving forward, we'll see that we'll have more of the solar customers, or customers with their own distributed generation, whether that's solar or wind or whatever renewable energy source that they have, will go on a demand rate, which will allow them to, if they do actually generate reliably at peak times, it'll allow them to get credit for that, for the cost they remove from the grid.
And would there be an impact on the conventional user that do not have any solar panels and so forth? Would they see their rates going up? Let's just say,
Sure.
A lot more people are now, banks are now lending to it.
Right.
Lending for solar panels. And it's become when you're looking at the end result of someone's property value,
Mm-hmm.
it actually increases one's property value in terms of an evaluation and an open market valuation as well. And it's a benefit because now you're giving them a credit and you're buying energy back from them as
Yes.
well.
Yep.
Would
So
that impact the conventional user in any capacity in your bottom line?
that's a really good question, and it was something that we were very concerned about when we developed the demand rates. The cost to the consumer, any increase in cost to the consumer is a negative thing, and I guess despite what might be thought, that is a very big driver for us in keeping those costs down, so that the consumers aren't impacted by things that they don't need to be impacted by. When we created the demand rates, what the customers with solar have, everything that they would be credited would be essentially what our avoided cost would be, whether that was fuel that wasn't burnt for the energy that they produced, or if they're reducing their demand on the grid, that would thereby reduce our requirement to have capital deployed to serve that demand. So they would get credits for that. So insofar as they are reducing our costs, they are getting credits. So therefore, we don't see it as a loss of business. We see it as just moving costs from one source to the next, and still providing the entire grid with all of their needs.
Well, just got to just nail it down one last bit. Having said all of that, would then the cost per kilowatt hour change to maintain your bottom line? Because you're vice president of customer
Sure.
service and technology, and obviously we got to say we have probably the most reliable energy provider in the Caribbean. I've been around other places. Kudos to all of you.
Thanks.
Without CUC
Working on
being
making it better.
well, without CUC, we have to be very frank with this. Without CUC being here, I don't think Cayman would be the destination of choice when it comes to financial services and probably, tourism.
Sure.
We got to be
That's
very
a very
frank with
fair
that.
statement.
And so there's no given, there's no nothing about that. But it's also in terms of cost of doing business. Electricity here is not cheap as well. You pay for reliability. The only concern I think most people have is that are they going to be subsidizing and making sure that CUC's bottom line to their shareholders are maintained when there's a bigger influx of solar panel consumers that are going to get credits? Even though that there's voids in your system, you still need to maintain cash flow and bottom line because you're capital intensive.
Mm-hmm.
That has to be offset somewhere down the line. Would we see you going back more frequently to off-reg as you did in the summer and said, look, we need an increase to come back to our shareholders? Would we see that a lot more frequently?
No, I don't think so. There's a couple of parts and concepts there that I'd like to address. So the demand rate program for renewable energy, or for distributed energy resources, is what it's called, the DER program.
Mm-hmm.
There is no additional cost that's passed on to the consumer. As I said before, this is a cost reallocation from, say, us spending money on fuel and capital requirements to serve a customer, and saying, okay, well, you are now providing that yourself. You're going to get that as a credit. And so there's no money transfer from one consumer to the next because there's no subsidy involved, right? We do have a core program which is subsidized, and one can debate about whether that was a good or a bad thing. But it really did allow for the solar industry here to start. So one may consider it to be seed money to have a solar industry in Grand Cayman. Should that subsidy continue infinitely, I would suggest that's probably not a good thing, particularly in light of what the costs of solar panels are now today compared to where they were when the core program started and the subsidies were required. That program has a subsidy, but that program also has a quota in terms of the amount of capacity that can go into it. And the reason for that is to limit what that subsidy is, right? So once that quota is filled, I see that the subsidy would go away. It wouldn't go away for the customers that are signed up onto it because they've got long-term contracts.
Correct.
But the growth of that subsidy would be stemmed by just closing off the quota and saying to customers, all right, if you want to do renewable energy, you have to do it on the demand rate program, which is a non-subsidized program. But what we're hearing in the market is viable with respect to making a return on their investment, which is great. So everybody's winning. We're getting a reduction of fuel and thereby a reduction of CO2. We're not getting an increased cost from that, and the consumers that invest in it are getting a return on their investment. So it's a win for everybody. With respect to other technologies, and I don't, you had mentioned, if we bring solar on, is it going to increase the cost of electricity? I would say if it was done incorrectly, absolutely. And that's what we want to avoid, and that's a very big part of why we did this plan. And looked at the future costing of certain technologies. I'll give you an example. Batteries for energy storage can help significantly with the deployment of large-scale solar. Well, large-scale solar right now is very cost advantageous compared to diesel. Well, not very, but a little bit cost advantageous. In the future, we expect to be substantially more so. But batteries are still on their downward cycle for cost. So do we put a bunch of solar in now and a battery right away? Or do we say, okay, well, you know what? Maybe if we wait 2 years to put the battery in because we think the cost is going to go down another 30%, and we put it in then, we take the 20 or so year project and push it out a little bit and get a greater cost savings as a result. And so the study has looked at that and optimize that timing as well, because it has those forward-looking cost curves. So all that to say is, I think you won't see us proposing any projects for renewable energy and I don't think Ofreg would be approving any of them if it's going to have an increase of cost to the consumer, right? So in all of these cases, we're looking, okay, well, we're going for the environmental benefits, we're going for the cost stability, we're making sure reliability is there, but we're not going after any of that if it's going to increase the cost to the consumer in any measurable way, any significant measurable way. You may find that maybe in 1 or 2 years of the 20-year cycle, there may be a higher cost, but when you look at the forward view on what happens with fuel, maybe not, right? But on a life cycle cost, we're looking at, instead of seeing costs rise as everybody would expect them to with fuel, we're looking at stable costs 20 years out.
Well, I'm excited about that because the last thing that we ever want to have is just another increase on probably the one thing that is the largest expenditure for either a business or a home.
It's definitely a large expenditure, yeah. I'm not sure it's as large as your mortgage, though.
Well, the second largest one. If you don't have a mortgage, it is the largest expenditure in that home, or in that property, in that investment. Sacha, if you don't mind holding on just a few more minutes.
Sure thing.
Just to do that, I got to do a little time check right now and pay some bills. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for tuning in. Happy Wednesday to all of you. And if you're just tuning in right now, I have Mr. Sacha Tibbetts in the studios with me. He is the Vice President of Customer Service and Technology at CUC. And we're talking about their new accepted plan that was accepted by the Utilities Regulation Competition Office, Ofreg. I don't know where there's a competition to this one particular one, but anyhow, we got Sacha in here. We're talking about the Integrated Resource Plan that was basically accepted by Ofreg. And we were talking about the whole entire goal, Sacha, of CUC to try to mitigate their carbon footprint, so to speak, and try to create a renewable source somewhere down the line. Now, I asked the question, would normal people have to subsidize this program? Because one thing that that we just got to be clear with is that right after Hurricane Ivan, we all had to pay this charge to rebuild in essence, for a long period of time. I believe it was probably in excess of 4 years at least that we were playing on those aspects of it. Now, on my CUC bill recently, I have a charge that I've never seen before on there called Renewable Energy Plan. Isn't that me subsidizing this whole entire program? I have to ask because that's why I was asking the question.
That's a fair question, and we get that question a lot. We that was not a new charge. What it was us breaking out the cost of renewable energy from fuel. They're both sources of energy, and they both are costs that. So when we buy renewable energy, the cost that we buy that renewable energy on is passed on to consumers. When we buy fuel, the cost of the energy produced by that fuel, due to the fuel cost, is passed on to consumers. So and CUC does not make profit on any of those monies. So in the early days of the core program, it was so small that the percentage of that cost that was associated with renewable energy was really perhaps not worth calculating to break out onto the bill. And once we saw that the amount of energy coming onto the grid from renewables passed, say, about 2%, we decided, all right, 2% is still small, which is why when you look at it on your bill, it's still a very small number. But that number is increasing. So what that is designed to do is to say, all right, of the energy that you used, this is how much of it came from renewable energy, and the rest is how much came from fuel, right? And right now, I think our renewable energy penetration is somewhere in the order of about 3%. And some of that energy, because of the subsidy that we talked about earlier on from the core program, is lower than the cost of fuel, and some of it is at a bulk rate from the Bodentown solar plant that is substantially cheaper than the core program. And in general, what you find is that the larger the plant that you put in, the cheaper it can be when you're putting in rooftops. The cost of the energy with the amortization of the asset over the energy that's produced over the life of the asset is higher than if you're putting these things in bulk on the ground.
All right. Well, Sacha, I had you over just a little longer, but can I make an invitation to you, sir, for you to come back?
Sure.
We got some other guests outside that's peeping their heads through. I can have this conversation all day long, especially, about your transmission distribution agreement and what that forecast, because in there is very specific as well that you as a company need to forecast down the line, along with government, what is anticipated in terms of population growth and trends and consumables. What do you anticipate and how you're going to actually take care of that? That's a mandate on all of you. So if we could, I would love to have you back into the studio,
Happy
sir.
to be here anytime.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Tibbetts.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for coming in. Maybe we can talk more about the programs and so forth that is happening with this particular aspect, but I'm glad that you laid the foundation initially and talked about, the win on your part with OffReg recently. But thank you very much, sir.
Thanks
Coming
for
up,
having us.
we're going